Hi, everybody. My name's Rae-Hunter. I'm the Communications Director for Future of Music Coalition. I hope you guys are all feeling like the total mind expansion from the last couple of days of conversations and wonderful panel discussions. My head is totally full with information, and it's about to pop. When we were first kicking around ideas for this year's Policy Summit, one of the themes that we landed on were, visionaries. Who can we get to come to this thing who, are really representing the future of music? And, the minute I heard that we were, going in that direction, I was like, dude, we have to get Daniel Ek from Spotify. And I never say dude, so, it's a pretty big deal. So why was I excited? Well, like pretty much every other music tech geek who's gotten to take this service for a spin, which I'm very lucky to have done, I was absolutely floored by it. So Spotify is a subscription music service, and it's also a free music service that you can listen to the tracks that you want to select yourself on demand. And when Daniel comes out, we'll talk a little bit more about what Spotify does. A simple way to think about it, Wired's columnist Elliot Van Buskirk, who will be here later today, talking to Brian Message from Radiohead's management team, among other things, has called Spotify like a magical version of iTunes in which you've already bought every song in the world. So I think that's a really good description, and I like to steal it a lot. Streaming on-demand music isn't completely new, but Spotify does get a lot of stuff right. It's got really good sound quality, a huge catalog, and I've yet to be able to make the thing hiccup. Like I said, it's free to use as long as you don't mind hearing some audio ads, but there's a hitch. It's not available in the States yet. So how am I using it, even if it's only available in Europe? I could tell you, but Dan's ex-people would have to, so. I'm just kidding, he's super nice. So Spotify's been racking up press mentions on both sides of the pond. They've got a really cool iPhone app that's available overseas in Europe, and we're all just waiting for this thing to land stateside. So we're very thrilled to have Dan Ek here to talk about Spotify and how he sees Spotify fitting into the future of music. And I am particularly psyched to be able to ask him a few questions. So I'd like to welcome Dan Ek to the stage. So Daniel, can you tell me a little bit about how you came up with the concept for Spotify? Because like I just mentioned, streaming music isn't completely new in terms of conceptual audio services, but was there something that you thought was missing in the digital marketplace that you felt could be well served by Spotify?
Yeah, I mean, in general, if you kind of look at the idea, we started the company in 2006. And what we did in 2006 is we kind of looked at the digital music landscape, and we figured that ultimately 95% or more is legal downloads. I actually think it's much more. I think it's probably 99% of all the content that's been used now on the internet is actually legal copies. And we saw that there's been a dramatic change in how people consume music. We believe that music is now more than ever consumed in the sense that people listen to more and more music than ever by a bigger diversity of artists. And music is probably the most social object there is, in the sense that you can share music with your friends. You do want to share music with your friends, but there's no legal service that actually facilitates that. The legal services are cumbersome, but they somehow facilitate that behavior. So we figured that the only way, you can try and legislate. In 2006, RIAA went after individual users trying to sue them, and we had similar cases in Europe, and we had legislation going on in Europe where, illegal file sharing would be deemed as illegal, and you'd be prosecuted, or you might get your internet connection suspended, and so on. And I ultimately believe that's wrong. I believe that the music industry is could be in a better position than it's ever been, in the sense that people are actually listening to more music than ever by a bigger diversity of artists, which should be good. We just haven't figured out the model behind it. And the truth is that the recorded model was a very good model, because it essentially gave, it was like, I've heard a lot of people in the industry mentioning it as a lottery ticket, because it was something like printing money. For great bands, you just put it out there and it sold like crazy, and you had great parties and everything was great. The truth now is that the music industry is a much more fragmented place. where there's streaming services, there's subscription service, there's the download services, it's about ticketing, it's about merchandise, it's about all these kind of forms. So what Spotify ultimately is a music platform. We want to be the music management platform through which you can share music with your friends, through how you can discover music, and we want to power services on the internet that want to do that.
Can you describe a little bit about the sharing aspect of Spotify? Because you guys can see it up there. It's really easy to use. You type the artist name in there. We've got Nicole up there. She'll pop up. You select the album, or you select the artist. And playlists are really easy because you can just grab the stuff and drag it like you would on iTunes over to your column. How does the sharing mechanism work, and where does that go?
So, I think we're in the first iteration of that, but any object in Spotify can be dragged and dropped onto any place, meaning a Skype conversation, Facebook, Twitter, all these kind of places. And you can even share playlists. So one of the things that we did was we created a collaborative playlist in which you can actually share a playlist, and you can, with your friends, jointly collaborate on how that playlist should work. And we've seen some fantastic stuff being done on top of that. And there's about now 50 playlist sharing sites which are focused only on aggregating all the playlists that Spotify have and facilitating the sharing. So I think we're in the early days of the whole kind of sharing concept, but my kind of vision of the music industry is that I think that Spotify or other services can facilitate trillions of transactions on a monthly basis. And some of that transactions will lead to purchases of music. Some of that transactions will lead to paying subscribers of music. Some of that will lead to people buying tickets and merchandise and so on. But it's a different model. It's nothing like the old model.
Now, when a minute ago you were talking about the really high percentage of illegal music that gets transmitted through the internet in this intermediary stage where maybe the petrochemical disc isn't the thing anymore, but we've unleashed this other thing, and music is like water. In the United States, there's been a lot of other music services that have kind of gone with the make it available first, license it later phenomenon. But Spotify was legit right from the beginning. So can you give us a little insight to how you managed to obtain such a broad array of content on this platform?
As we said, we started the company in 2006, and we launched the service in October 2008. So I spent more than 2.5 years going through licensing content. And one of the things that I felt was really important was to, from the day one, have everyone on board, and not only the majors, but all the indie content as well. And I think that's something that, the PRI angle might be that Spotify just has a lot of music, but what I feel is really interesting is the fact that around 25% of the content that's being played on Spotify is indie content, and that's growing. Because people discover a lot of new music. We don't facilitate any kind of sophisticated discovery mechanisms, but the truth is that people just browse music with Spotify, and they listen to more music than any other service that I do know of. So I mean, on an average, what a Rhapsody user here in the US consumes, Spotify on an average probably has 4 or 5 times that usage.
Now, one question I have, since we're talking about independent content, our conference is very much musician-powered, and I'm sure that we have plenty of independent artists or unaffiliated artists in the audience right now who are wondering about how they would go about getting on Spotify. You mentioned Rhapsody. It's another fantastic service. We heard from Tim Quirk yesterday. And in the States, if you're an unaffiliated artist, you can go through an intermediary that for a fairly low cost will get your stuff stocked in all the digital stores. This is Lala, this is the legal version of Napster, this is Rhapsody. But to my knowledge, I don't know of anything like that on Spotify for the unaffiliated artist. Any plans?
It's a bunch of them. We support a lot of aggregators. So we everything from CD Baby to The Orchard, Iota, we support a bunch of these guys as well. There's a new site in Europe called Record Union, there's Stereo Music, and so that there's a lot of these kind of aggregation services that we do support, and hopefully Later down the road, we can support artists uploading music directly to the Spotify platform as well. But so far, if you want to get your music on Spotify, you go through one of the aggregators, and I think it's posted on our webpage which aggregators we support if you want to get your music onto the service. But I mean, just getting back to that, I think we're seeing more and more unaffiliated artists. And one of the things that Spotify want to do, which I've talked to a lot of managers and artists about, is the fact that we want to give the data back to artists.
That's great.
And we do know a lot about our users with Spotify. We know the age of them, we know the location of them, we know the gender, and all of this stuff can be used not to only see Spotify as the distribution channel, but as a marketing channel for all the other activities. I mean, we're not the best company doing merchandise or ticketing or that kind of thing, but if we can give the data and be transparent about the data with our platform, I think a lot of artists will be intelligent enough to make wise decisions about in which context they want to be seen, and so on.
That's great news. I'm sure everyone's happy to hear that. Now, I want to geek out just for a second. This is kind of me geeking out here, so if you guys don't care about this, it's too bad. One thing that I've noticed about Spotify is the fact that the actual desktop client on your computer is really rugged, and there's no buffer time at all. Like, I can jump around at any point in the track, and other things on my computer, I'll get the little Macintosh spinning ball, but Spotify just keeps on going. How important was that to you in the design? Can you tell us a little bit about what you built in on the system side without getting too arcane?
So I mean, I think it's been crucial because if you kind of look at the Spotify experience, we don't have the best recommendation system. The fact is we don't have a recommendation system alive yet. And we don't offer any kind of good discovery mechanism. Yet we have 4 or 5 times the usage that any other service has. And the only reason why that's true is because of the speed. Because we make it so easy for people to just search for music and play music, and it's instant. So people are incentivized to actually discover music that way. And sort of way, we took the Google approach but did it for music, because if you look at what Google did for search, it was essentially just making it easier to search for whatever type of content they wanted and just play. And what's happening is that we know for a fact that when buffer times increase, we get a lot less usage. But we want people to be comfortable around having all their music available in the cloud and using it as a primary music source, which is also why, when we've introduced stuff like mobile now, we've seen an incredible uptake in the amount of paying customers, because again, people don't perceive it as the renting concept because it's as fast as if you would have had the music locally on your computer.
Right, and unlike the illegal model, you know what you're getting too. And a lot of times, if you're searching the torrent sites, it might not be the file you want. It might be corrupted. It might be partial. It might have viruses. So that's really interesting. Now, Spotify exists both as a free-to-the-user version with intermittent audio ads that come in. Right now, when I secretly use Spotify, it's a cheeky British voice, so it's really great, but when it comes to America, I'm sure that'll turn into an annoying American voice, and I will pay for it then, because I don't want to hear that. Right now, it's fun. So you can also pay for a premium subscription service, which removes the ads and also contains extra features. Can you explain some of those ad-free extras? I know you guys just did the offline content thing, where you can actually store your playlists offline. And do you intend to keep adding features to make that pay version more attractive? And can you give us a hint?
Sure. So I mean, on the paid side, we try and differentiate the service on a few things. But one of the most important things is that we haven't differentiated the service in terms of content, because we believe that, with the exception of exclusives and so on, but we believe that the content side is already out there in the piracy network anyway. So what we want to do instead is we want to give people a better experience in the premium service. So some of the functionality that we have in the paid service is better sound quality. We offer 320 sound quality to paying customers. And the logic is the cost is more to actually distribute the content. So it makes sense. The second thing is portability. We believe that one of the key things that people are prepared to pay for is the fact to bring the music with you. You're fine with Spotify to actually use it on your desktop, stream away as much as you want. But when you move it to the to a mobile device, then we kind of say, well, you have to pay for it.
Right.
So that's the kind of two major drivers. But there's also stuff like we've got some settings which allows you to fine-tune how Spotify works in the premium version. And I think you'll see some of that develop. And as you mentioned, we just launched the offline service, which allows you to cache playlists for offline usage. There will be some new functionality that will be added before it gets to the free service, and one of those things that we're kind of looking at is how we can make the playlist concept more interesting.
Now, there's two services that I particularly like, completely different models in the United States. Both have a subscription aspect. Rhapsody, which I talked about before, they do a really good job with editorial. And eMusic as well has really stepped up their game in terms of editorial. And I think that we'll be talking later today about the future of music journalism and what are the vehicles to learn who's curating the music. Any plans to roll that into the premium or the free version?
So I mean, that's a more philosophical thing for us. We don't think we're good on the editorial side, and we don't anticipate to be good on that side. What we want to do is we want to provide a platform, which means that in the best of worlds, we want to see guys that are really good at editorial building that stuff into Spotify.
So you're going to keep some of that open for other people to create.
And I think what you'll see, and this is probably the biggest shift with Spotify, is you'll see us open up a range of APIs which will power a lot of websites.
Interesting.
So I mean, we're already seeing it in the UK, for instance, where we're quite big. We're seeing music journalists using Spotify as the way of talking about new music. Sure. They have a link to the specific albums that they review. They create playlists of their top tracks right now that they're listening to. Hopefully later on they might even publish their listening history so that people can actually tune into what...
I've actually been seeing that a little bit with some of the folks that I follow on Twitter. Andrew Dubber, I believe, is a European... is he British, I believe? I think he's British. We'll just say he's British, and if he's not, he can correct us later because he's not here. But anyway, he tweets, his Spotify playlist, and he had a thing that he would do once a week, and oh, there goes my mic. Oh, no, it's still here. And unfortunately, I can't do it because, when it doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
But it was just really an interesting concept because, he's got a lot of followers and he can listen to a bunch of music, create a playlist, and then all of a sudden step up to that megaphone that is Twitter and broadcast it to the world. Yeah. But it's all legal and licensed, and, the people who are getting paid. So it's very interesting. I wanted to ask you, though, there's been other sites and services that have experimented with ad-based revenue generating models that haven't quite fared so well, and a lot of them have struggled to meet their licensing or even operational costs. And also the paid subscription services have had some difficulty in building and sustaining a user base. How do you think Spotify is going to avoid those pitfalls?
So I think it's interesting because the truth is that if you look at an ad-supported model on its own, I don't think that's going to work for the industry. If you look at subscription model on its own, I don't think that's going to work for the industry either. I mean, economically, on a per-user basis, it will definitely work. But the problem is that so far, none of them have gained any traction. And I think it is because the ultimate thing, and kind of what we're trying to get at with Spotify, is that it's about everything in one. And it's about building the platform that allows you to share music with your friends. And when you start seeing those sharing patterns, then it becomes more and more obvious that through Spotify, we don't really care how you pay. You will pay by watching adverts. You will pay by, if you want to own music, that's fine. Purchase the music that you want to own, get it onto your iPod or other device of choice. And the truth is that, I think the music industry has suffered a lot the last 10 years because of the stronghold that some players have had on the industry, both in terms of the content side and, of course, the services side. But ultimately, I think, the device strategy has been poor. And I think, the ISP and carrier uptake has been poor as well, because the truth is that they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars investing into licenses, but had to build the services themselves, and the services have failed because of cumbersome DRM stuff and other. What we want to do with Spotify is we just want to facilitate all of that. So we want to go in with the ISPs and carriers and say, here's a service that works.
Sure.
You can give this to your users, and you can distribute it. And you can package the music.
Right.
And that's one aspect. The other aspect, the ad-supported part, becomes great for promotional aspects. It becomes a viable revenue source as well. I don't know about US, but if you would take 1% of the display ads and 1% of the radio ads, and you would put them in a service like Spotify, you would then get 30% of all digital revenues in the UK. So that's how big ad-supported music could be. Then add, as an addition, what subscription could be, and then gather that there's a trillion transaction where a few of those generate purchases. And I think the music industry has the potential of becoming, if it's a $17 billion industry now, it could be a $40 billion industry again. But it might not be concentrated to 4 majors. It might be that the ecosystem is much, much bigger.
Sure. But allowing more players to participate in the platform is probably mutually beneficial at the end of the day. That kind of gets into my next question. Here in the States, some of us who are watching Music Tech Issues were just sort of on pins and needles waiting to see if the Spotify iPhone application would be approved because, obviously Apple has their iTunes model where you pay for individual downloads, and Spotify is a different model. Either, I believe that you showed me that you can store offline or cache your playlists when you're not on a network, but in general it's still that streaming access service. Now, everyone was like, basically betting. I mean, I probably would have lost because I can't remember what my bet was, but do you have any thoughts of why that was approved? I mean, we know Rhapsody was approved too around the same time. What's your thoughts there? Is it just a mystery? Did it just happen?
No, I mean, a lot of people perceive Apple to be this anti-competitive beast. And the truth, is that it probably was a while ago. But if you look at the Apple's kind of revenue streams right now, and you kind of look at where they generate the revenue, you start seeing that the App Store has already surpassed iTunes revenues by far.
Sure.
So it's become more interesting for Apple to have a vibrant app system. That's at least my belief. This is not something that Apple has communicated to me, but I think it's more interesting to have a platform that enables as many of the apps as possible to get onto the App Store, because ultimately it aids them in selling iPods and iPod Touches and iPhones and probably more devices coming out with App Stores as well. So my way of looking at it is that all these services drive the Apple ecosystem.
Sure.
So I think that's much of the reason why Spotify and Rhapsody got approved.
Cool. I just want to go big picture for a second because technology changes so fast that it's tough to even predict what digital music might look like next year. But we've heard that you've got a longer view for Spotify, and I just wanted to know what your visions were for, say, the next 5 to 10 years.
Normally it's fun because I don't do predictions about the internet that is longer than 3 years because...
Well, we do predictions all the time here. So
tend to be wrong. So with the reservation that will likely be wrong. I mean, my vision for Spotify, as I said, is to become the music like water utility, where you manage your music, that services like, could be iMeme, Last.fm, could be all of those guys, or even more so, can use us to build great apps on top of Spotify and to kind of extend the music side of things. And hopefully, Spotify, the platform, can be used to getting your music onto devices that currently, today, it's too cumbersome to get it out to, like Nokia devices or Blackberries and so on, and kind of open up the ecosystem so that you can use music wherever you want to. And you can pay through even being an ad-supported user, or you can pay by being a subscriber, you can pay by buying occasional downloads or actually physical products as well, or merchandise or ticketing, and all that through a platform that musicians can interact with. They can look at the data that they get. They can affect how they are promoted through this platform, what kind of offerings they've got. They can tailor it. Hopefully we can make some interesting data predictions about how they're likely going to act in different situations, to present them with good alternatives as well on how to purchase music.
It's funny, you know, you've probably heard the phrase like, where's my jetpack, you know, or where's the flying cars, but it's easy to see, you know, if this stuff takes off, you could probably just, you have that Jetsons home where you could come home and say, play this, and your house goes, ding.
Yeah.
I want to live there.
Great place.
We've also focused a bit on artist compensation in new business models in the course of this conference, particularly on our first day on Sunday. What role do you think Spotify will play long-term in terms of artist revenue streams? Because right now it seems like the margins might be a little bit narrow for both the sound copyright owners, the publishers, songwriters, and the actual performing artists.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's a valid point, and I'm not sure that if you kind of look at how the split works today, that's going to remain the way it is. But in terms of revenue, I mean, we ultimately hope to be a very viable revenue source. And what's interesting, if you kind of look at my native country, Sweden, to kind of prove our point, has been that Sweden has been the worst market in Europe in terms of digital versus physical. So the digital market hasn't picked up, and that's, you know, more than 90% of the population is broadband.
You also have the pirate party, let's not forget.
And we've got the pirate party, so everyone's you know, using legal services. But what's interesting is that Spotify now has about 15% of the population using Spotify.
Wow.
80% of them claim that they're not file sharing anymore. And we've actually got evidence now from ISPs that their BitTorrent traffic has decreased, LimeWire has decreased, Spotify has increased, but you know, it's a legal alternative. Out of the music revenues today, I think the last public figures that I heard was somewhere around 35 to 50% of all digital revenues now comes from Spotify, wow. Which means that we're actually bigger than iTunes in that market.
That's pretty amazing.
And what we're seeing is that it's still a steady growth in terms of revenues in that market. And I actually think that we can double digital market in probably about a year's time from when we launched, which is quite cool. Yeah, so I do think that we can be a viable revenue source, and especially in the markets that are underdeveloped today. Mm-hmm. It will probably take longer time to get to the point where we penetrate more developed countries like the US and so on in terms of embrace. But at the same time, I mean, what's interesting with the Spotify model is that the people that look at the revenue reports that we were generating in March and then looked at the same revenue reports that were generated in June, we're seeing a couple of 100% increase in royalties. Wow. And we're growing now by about 50 to 70% month on month in terms of revenues back to the artists.
One question there, though. You guys are still in beta mode, even in Europe, and we did notice that Spotify has gone back to the invite model for the free version.
Yep.
And is that because it's difficult to sustain the payouts in terms of who, you know, what's the math there? What's the reasoning there?
So the reasoning has been about the quality of service, and the truth is that we've been working now quite heavily on investing in new data centers, because Spotify is growing at the pace where we're adding 50,000 new users a day. Even now with invitations, we're probably around 25,000 a day. And growing a service at that pace, especially when you're streaming that kind of content that you're doing, even though we're using peer-to-peer, that's quite a feat. And it puts a lot of strain, not only on Spotify, but it actually puts strains on network. And we know several ISPs that have actually had to increase their capacity based on the fact that we consume so much bandwidth in their network. So it's growing cautiously at the same time as we're obviously, you know, we want to make sure that we grow our revenues at the same time as we grow our users.
Now, do you feel confident that you're going to be able to phase that correctly? So, you know, you can get that massive adoption that's really necessary to make the service sustainable and rewarding to artists in terms of revenue, and also solve some of those tricky technology issues like bandwidth gobbling and, you know, just actually serving like the high quality streams and, you know, even the revenue. Do you feel good about, you know, how this is going to roll out?
I hope so. The only thing I can mention is that, you know, we're by far the biggest subscription service in Europe, and we're growing really, really fast, even on the paid side. So I think a lot of people will be surprised by kind of looking at how we're doing on the revenue side, and I'm actually, I'm starting to look at the numbers, and they're starting to look really good. It's taken us about a year to get there, but the growth that we're seeing month to month is really, really good at the moment. So, I mean, we're investing heavily into being able to handle more users, and we want to make sure that we can grow. And at the same time, obviously, we're very careful about not devaluing the music, which is why we also have an invite system in that regard, so that we can keep the pace and not just show to artists that, hey, you got 5 million streams and the revenue is $5.
Okay.
So we're very cautious about that, and still at the same time we're a startup, and we can't, obviously pay hundreds of millions of dollars in licensing fee to try and figure this model out.
Mm-hmm. I've got one last question for you, then I think maybe we can turn it over to the audience. I'm sure they have a few. Here's the one that I don't know if you're perfectly ready to answer yet, but what everybody, including myself, wants to know: when can we expect a US launch?
Yeah.
It's the million-dollar question.
It is. And the honest answer is that we don't know yet. The most important thing is that we're aiming towards the end of the year or the beginning of the next, but the most important thing for us is to get the licenses right. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people in the US that we need to secure licenses for. It's the publishers, it's the collecting societies, it's the record labels, of course, but it's also a matter of fact that what we want to do a few things better than what we did in Europe. Okay. So we want to make sure that we can time it with advertisers, maybe find a partner to go in with in the US. But more importantly, it's about the licensing side and figuring that one out and getting everyone comfortable around the fact that what we're aiming towards is 1 trillion transactions, and it's going to be really, really big. Mm-hmm. So how do we get there? And at the same time, not devaluing the music and actually grow the business, because, so far when I look at the music business, the truth is that nothing I've seen so far has any kind of real potential to actually grow the industry. It's more about keeping it the way it's been or making sure that there's not too much decline, but I'm not interested in that. I don't think that the music industry should be a $5 billion industry. I don't think it should be a $10 industry. I think it could be a $40 billion industry if done right. But we need to shift the model, because the model isn't just selling a la carte music anymore. It's about all of these different business models.
So optimistic about folks coming around to that view?
Of course, but it takes some time because it's different. And we're not going to pay the standard penny per play that all of the other some services have had in the past, because the truth is that there's no ad-supported music service that can tolerate those kind of revenues, royalty checks.
Great. If we want to turn it over to the audience and have somebody with a microphone walking around, or okay, very good. Right there.
Hi, my name is Philippe. I'm from France, and I'm a musician. And during this conference, I'm always a bit confused about all the model we exposed with Last.fm, now with Spotify. I would like to have some concrete information. For example, on Spotify, how do you pay the artists with the streaming model?
So I can't go into too much details about that. Well, what I can say is that we get a pool of revenues, and the pool of revenues are then shared based on a pro-rata basis. Meaning that, for an instance, let's assume for a while that you count for 1% of all the music that's been played on Spotify. So we then share the revenues that we got between the rights holders and ourselves, and then the percentage of that you get as well. And that's independent of if it's download revenues or if it's subscription revenues or if it's advertising revenues. And obviously the price points on the downloads is pretty much the same as on other download services and so on. But essentially we share all of the revenues that we get in, not only downloads, but subscription and ad revenues as well. And those are growing. So I mean, if you kind of put a number on the per track amount that we pay, the number would have been one thing in March, and it's a completely different number now because it's been growing. So I mean, what's interesting about this model, as I mentioned, is if we can take 1%, and this is UK, of display and 1% of audio, that could be 20, 30% of the digital music market today. So looking at this, instead of looking at what can I get from an individual play, the music industry needs to look at this from a basis of revenue per user. And I think that the revenue that we can get through all of these different things is going to amass to a much bigger music industry than it's ever been before. So I guess that's kind of what I can say in terms of how we pay artists. But we share all of the revenue that we get into the service.
Right over here. Yeah.
Hi, good morning, Daniel. It's great to see you starting your conversations in the U.S. well in advance of the launch. My name is Deborah Newman. I think it's pretty exciting what you're doing. I actually have two questions. They're sort of unrelated. One is the quick question, and that is, could you explain a little bit about how the peer-to-peer aspect works to facilitate the streaming and the immediacy and the high-quality streaming? And the other, I'm going to ask them back to back, is I understand that the major labels and Merlin, I guess, which represents the indies in the UK and Europe, have an ownership position of something in the 17% range. I'm curious as to how that's managed in terms of your licensing discussions in the US with the label's position, and what, if any, influence do they have over the development of the service, the positioning of the service, the marketing of the service, you know, and all the business aspects of the service?
So the first question is around the peer-to-peer system, and the peer-to-peer system is a closed peer-to-peer system. It doesn't involve any other peer-to-peer system, and it's a proprietary protocol that we've developed. We developed it for two reasons mainly. One is to offload the cost of actually distributing the content. The other one is to provide the immediacy of the service. And the fun thing is that a lot of that, you know, normally in peer-to-peer means those two things doesn't go hand in hand. You get one, but you don't get the other. But we kind of looked at the problem differently, and technically, normally, you slice the files vertically. What we've done is we've actually sliced them horizontally as well, which allows you to, there's some overhead in the network, but at the same time, it means that we can ramp up quality over time, and we can use a lot of different sources. And the benefit is that it actually helps ISPs reduce traffic cost as well, because we can keep it within the network, so it reduces transit and so on. To the second question, I'm not really allowed to comment on equity questions, but what I can say is that Spotify is independently run. We don't have anyone from any music company on our board. We don't have any single individual from the music industry as an advisor. We have music attorneys, of course, but we don't have anyone from the record labels as an advisor. They, of course, have input on the product, but the truth is that we can choose to do pretty much what we want to do with the product, as long as it's, you know, in the region of what we've licensed. But in terms of roadmap, the main thing that the record labels affect is how to use Spotify as a promotional tool. One of the things that we didn't see early on, and the mistake on our part, was that we didn't know really how to work together with the labels. So we kind of did this distribution platform, but the truth is we should have realized much earlier on that we needed to make it as a promotional and marketing platform as well. But one of the things that we did right was that we never let an individual label run the editorial aspect of the service. And there's not a single label that have any sort of right on how much editorial space that they should control and so on. So everything has been done algorithmic, and there's not any favoritism over a certain type of content, like major label content, which is also why 25% of all of our plays are indie content. So if you look at our start page, which features new releases, half of the releases are already established artists, and already established means in the Spotify world that they've got a high play count. It's not because they're signed to a major label or something else. They just got a high play count. And the other half is new artists, meaning that they don't have a previous history. Could be major label, could be independent label as well. So hopefully that answers some of the dynamics that we do. But I think it's important that obviously, record labels have great ideas about how to develop the service, much like artists have great ideas about how to develop the service. But we're not controlled by the record labels, we're not controlled by artists, but what we want to do is we want to be this platform that record labels can use, and artists can use, and managers can use, and composers can use as well. And I know for a fact that a lot of the A&R guys at the record labels use Spotify as a tool to speak to composers and musicians about how to develop the artists, which I'm thrilled about. And hopefully we can do even more stuff, and other people can build apps on top of Spotify that facilitates sort of similar type of artists like this one, or even taking bits and pieces of tracks and putting them together.
In front. Very front. Make you run.
Thanks. The idea sounds great. I'm just curious about, as you continue to develop the idea and maybe tie in other things like being able to buy tickets or merch, do all those revenue streams also get shared with everybody, or do you commission on that? Or I'm just wondering, as it seems like if it's a one-stop shop for all these different things, is all that revenue going to be sort of in the same pot and shared the same way?
So I think the way we're kind of seeing it in terms of that, we're probably going to take some sort of cut to facilitate the transaction. And actually, we're quite upfront about it. We have a lot of data about how to, both credit card data from our users, but also billing data through ISPs and carriers and so on. And what we want to facilitate in that regards is a billing platform. So that means that we ultimately want to give the control of the artist page back to the artist, which means that ticketing and merchandise could be up to individual artists. And if you want to work with Live Nation, that's fine. If you want to work with something on your own, that's fine as well. What we can help you with, and the value that we can bring, is that we can facilitate the billing. And what we do is we take a 30% cut of that, and 70% goes back to the artist. So I think in that regards, around the side revenue, we hopefully can facilitate the platform that allows individual artists to and labels and so on to promote different types of revenue streams, and hopefully they'll see a value in adding Spotify as a billing partner, because we already of course have a lot of data about our users that we can use to make the targeting better and provide more efficient billing.
Unfortunately, we got to keep the trains running on time, so that's all the questions we're going to be able to take. But I definitely really want to thank Daniel Ek for coming to be with us today.